Now this is a good Star Trek book. This book knows its audience. It gets right into the action, it has good pacing, good characters, good plot, an interesting story. I seriously loved all 294 pages of this book. What's that? It has 310 pages. Come on, Gene, you gotta stick the landing. Okay, so I forgot to do this in the first video of this series because, to be honest, it never occurred to me that it might be necessary, but I'm going to say it just in case. This video will contain spoilers for this book, The Peacekeepers by Gene Deweese. I hope I'm saying that right. If you happen to be watching this video and you have not read this 37-year-old novel and you really wanted to finish it before having the plot spoiled, then I just don't know what to tell you. After 4 decades, it's kind of on you. Alright, first things first, I want to talk for a moment about the cover of this book. I'm going to throw it up on the screen there. I'm a child of the 80s and 90s who grew up reading science fiction, fantasy, and mystery novels. I have on multiple occasions chosen a book at a used bookstore solely based on cover art that looked cool but ultimately had absolutely nothing to do with the story contained in the book. Cover art in the old days in the science fiction genre particularly was a wild ride, to put it mildly. So naturally, to this day, when I pick up a book, I immediately look at the cover art before anything else, and this book has some interesting quirks with the cover. You see, here we have the disembodied heads of Picard, Troy, and Worf floating above some kind of stock sci-fi cover art spacecraft, which in turn is hovering over an Earth-like, M-class planet with 2 moons. I'll start with the glaring, unforgivable error that anyone who has read this book will immediately pick up on. I am reading from page 256, the opening lines of chapter 16. Approaching the system from almost directly above its ecliptic plane, the Enterprise sensors reached out. 1.04 solar masses, sir, Worf announced. 6 planets. Second one out, perfect, Class M. No natural satellites, but 1 artificial satellite with mass several times that of the Enterprise. No others detectable at this range. Moons are natural satellites. Why does the cover art depict a planet with 2 moons? Is this some other unrelated planet, or perhaps those 2 moons are other planets in the system, and they just happen to be super close together? I don't know. Anyway, there's probably not enough people that care about that for me to spend any more time on it. The second issue is the disembodied heads, Picard, Worf, and Troy. This is a Geordi and Data story, and a good Geordi and Data story at that. Picard, Troy, and Worf are barely in this book and have no significant bearing on the plot. I just find it weird that we don't get Geordi and Data's disembodied heads on the cover. Maybe Charlon's head. Who's Charlon? Well, don't worry, I'll tell you that in a minute. Alright, so about the author. Oh, what? You were expecting me to openly speculate / complain, specuplane about the sci-fi stock starship on the cover? That isn't the Enterprise. Why is it on the cover? Well, that ship is a very accurate depiction of a ship that actually does appear in the story and plays a role in the plot, if briefly. From page 278. A glinting metallic blue, the alien ship dwarfed the Enterprise. Any of its 3 rounded fortress-like segments would have contained the Enterprise. Stubby wings extended out on either side of the forward segment tipped with what could have been drive units or weapons, each as large by itself as a medium-class starship. Like a space-going mountain, it exuded an impression of raw, massive power. Yeah, so that's... sounds like the book on the cover. Now, for about the author. Gene Deweese. Again, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Did some writing in his lifetime. He wrote or co-wrote 7 Star Trek novels, but that's not all. He wrote 9 Gothic mystery novels. A genre I don't think I've ever heard of, but deep down inside I think I always knew existed. He also wrote novels from the A Man Named Uncle universe, Lost in Space universe, and Dinotopia universe. He He wrote something called Adventures of the 2-Minute Werewolf that got turned into a TV movie, and he also co-wrote a nonfiction book on doll making. Yes, you heard that right. Just look at this thing. I'm not afraid of dolls, but this cover is making me feel like I'm in the wrong on that one. And he was a technical writer on the Apollo program. Now, I'm not entirely sure what a technical writer does, but I choose to believe that without Gene Deweese, Neil Armstrong never would have walked on the moon. But being single-handedly responsible for landing a man on the moon was not his greatest accomplishment. No, the single greatest gift that Gene Deweese gave the world was the Geordi and Data team-up adventure that I didn't know I wanted, but I now know that I really desperately needed. And that brings us to the plot of the book. As I said in my little cold open thing for this video, this book knows its audience and it is written for them. It rightfully assumes that if someone is reading this novel, they likely have some familiarity with the world it's set in, so the author skips over any lengthy introduction to the world or to the characters. He gets right to the point, having the Enterprise discover a derelict spacecraft floating through space on page 3 that goes on to incite the rest of the plot of the book. And he does all of this without ever visiting Soviet Russia or describing anybody's hair in painful detail. Excellent start. An away team beams over to the derelict, as it's called for the rest of the novel, and they begin to investigate. Mysterious things happen. There are no life forms on board. The ship has a very bare, basic design, and there's no apparent controls anywhere. But suddenly, circuits begin to activate, radiation begins leaking, and there is a antimatter bomb booby trap that they have to beam out into space. But in the process of transporting the bomb out into space, they damage the shielding around the ship's core, and radiation begins to leak even harder. Radiation levels rise until Geordi and Data need to be beamed back to the Enterprise, but just as Ensign Carpelli, who, by the way, has just as big of a role in this book as cover model Jean-Luc Picard, locks onto them to beam them back to the Enterprise, they disappear. The Enterprise has no idea where they are. Not only are they out of range of the best of Federation transporter technology, but they are beyond long-range sensor range as well. Are they dead? Were they dematerialized and never rematerialized? Were they beamed out into space? Were they beamed somewhere else on the derelict that they just can't find with the sensors? These are all questions that must be asked and answered by the Enterprise crew over the course of the novel, while we follow the real heroes, Geordi and Data, who it turns out were whisked light years away to a similar ship orbiting a far-off planet. At the beginning of every chapter, we get flashbacks to the Enterprise, but they're basically just variations of Picard saying, "Worf, point sensors this way," and Worf saying, "Sure," and then pointing sensors that way. So I'm just going to ignore them until they become important again. So we have Geordi and Data on this space station orbiting this mysterious planet where they make excellent use of the Universal Translator, a piece of equipment that is pretty much always present in the Star Trek universe but never really gets focused on in any kind of satisfying way. But I actually really liked the way they used it in this book, with them subtly turning it on and off and pretending it was broken when they needed to talk without these strange aliens that they will soon meet, understanding them. Also, for the remainder of this book, outside of the brief periods where we are back on board the Enterprise, there is either no gravity or kind of reduced weird space station gravity, something that I kept forgetting, and quite frankly I think the author may have forgotten a few times as well. But whatever, minor thing, gravity. We don't really need to focus on that too much. Let's focus on the plot. Geordi and Data are found by 3 human-like characters who take them off of the space station to their leader. But on their way, one of them pulls out a gun and tries to shoot Geordi and Data. Geordi gets the jump on him by using the see-in-the-dark function on his visor and fires his phaser. But before he can fire his phaser a second time, everyone, including the 3 aliens, are knocked unconscious. They awake sometime later to find that none of their equipment or weapons have been taken. Geordi makes some Wizard of Oz analogies and then has to explain them to Data, a reoccurring theme in this book, and then they discuss their situation for a bit. Before they can figure anything out, an older man enters the room, and Geordi recognizes his face as being the face that was emblazoned on the front of the uniforms that the 3 men that came to get them, were wearing. He introduces himself as Charlon, and asks Geordi and Data if they are the Builders. So Geordi makes a choice here. he decides to go along with it and pretend that they are these builders that they don't really know anything about. Despite believing that Geordi and Data are the builders now, Charlon, who loves a good monologue, goes on to describe to them who the builders were and that they were the ones that left this space station that he calls the Repository of Gifts in orbit around his planet. Charlon tells them that he hopes that they're happy with the uses he's made of their gifts and explains that he used these gifts to save his planet that was on the brink of destroying itself via nuclear war. As the story continues, Geordi and Data work to find a way back to the Enterprise while indulging Charlon on his explanations of all the great works that he has done to save this planet. They believe that their only hope is to get into this repository of gifts that Charlon has been talking about, in the hopes that there is a transporter there powerful enough to get them back to the Enterprise. They learn that Charlon is the only person from this planet who has been on board the station, this repository, and is the only one who has access to these gifts. Charlon is a very suspicious person who does not trust anyone else, even his closest allies, with these gifts that he has access to, and he has an ever-growing list of enemies. Geordi and Data also learn that the actions he's taken to maintain peace on this planet may not be as altruistic as he's made them out to be. They end up meeting up with Charlon's brother Chartel, who Charlon believed had been killed. Chartel tells them the real story of how Charlon got access to the gifts and gained this power, and he reveals that Charlon has been using these gifts to maintain his grip on power, and that the people of the planet outside of the world of the Peacekeepers do not appreciate what he's been doing. Now, the world of the Peacekeepers is what Charlon calls all of his allies that live in orbit in this space habitat. So there's, I can't remember the number, a few hundred of these peacekeepers who are basically ruling and subjugating this entire surface planet who have no say in anything. The people on the surface of the planet have begun working with some of the people on the space habitat who are no longer loyal to Charlon, and they are all plotting to destroy the repository of gifts in an attempt to regain power for the people of the planet. They no longer want to be controlled by Charlon and his gifts, they want the opportunity to govern themselves and make their own choices. Eventually, about 2/3 of the way through the novel, the Enterprise takes the risk of recreating the exact scenario that ended up in Data and Geordi being transported light years away, and send Riker and Yar along with some subspace transmitters to the Peacekeepers planet as well. Of course, the subspace translators break during the transport, so they still can't contact the Enterprise, but now Riker and Yar are there. They end up finding Geordi and Data. Geordi has to get them all up to speed on what's been happening, and quite frankly, Yar and Riker don't really do anything important other than be there and get things explained to them. So I kind of would have preferred it if the novel had just remained Data and Geordi. There really was nothing served by having Riker and Yar there as well. So when the Enterprise realizes that these subspace transmitters did not work, they decide to start going solar system to solar system, scanning for Geordi and Data's comm badge signals. Something I didn't realize was such an easy option, and something they probably should have been doing from the start, because the Enterprise eventually finds them. And just in time, too, because the 4 Enterprise crew members and Charlon all managed to get themselves teleported out into space by Charlon after crossing him and attempting to take over control of the gifts. At this point, Chartel has called up his allies from the planet's surface, who are on their way in ships ready to destroy the repository. The Enterprise, however, destroys the repository before the ships can get to it, so when the ships arrive, they declare that they are going to destroy the space habitat and kill all of the Peacekeepers in the process, as payback for the 50 years of subjugation that they have had to endure. And then the end of the book happens. Remember in my opening when I said I really enjoyed 294 of the 310 pages of this book? Well, the last chapter of this book, the final 16 pages, was something else. This was a really good book. I enjoyed it for a lot of reasons that I'll get into shortly, but the final chapter of this book was, definitely an interesting choice. You see, as soon as they returned to the Enterprise, Data started going through some old rumors that the Federation had acquired from the Ferengi about an ancient civilization that had once existed in this part of space. A civilization that is likely responsible for the derelict and the repository of gifts. Well, when the men from the surface of the planet arrive in their ships to kill the Peacekeepers, the senior crew of the Enterprise, who are bound by the Prime Directive to not interfere with non-warp civilizations, decide that they really kind of want to interfere with this non-warp civilization just one more time. And Data, in digging through these Ferengi rumors, thinks he has found a solution to the problem. They decide to dress Worf up in full Klingon battle gear and stick him in a holodeck representation of a Klingon battlecruiser and have him growl and yell and pretend to be one of the builders. He transports the leaders of the uprising against Sharlon onto the holodeck, freezes them in place, and then calls them boring and annoying and says that the whole 50 years was just him toying with them and controlling Sharlon into doing his bidding. He tells them that he wants to watch them destroy themselves, to which they rightfully respond by asking if he wants to watch them destroy themselves, why did he destroy all of their nuclear weapons and actively prevent them from destroying themselves for 50 years, to which Worf has no real answer outside of, for funsies. And then a giant hologram of Sharlon's head appears and tells them that the Builder was only able to control him because he was alone, and if they use the power of friendship and thinking really hard about Shartel, they should be able to defeat the Builder. Then, as Worf is distracted with his back turned as he tries to punch the hologram into silence, the power of positive thinking frees Lin Prawn. Forgot his name. That's the leader of the ships from the surface. I forgot to introduce him. He gets free and he stabs Worf in the back. They all decide that this means they should live in peace with their former oppressors and go back to advancing as a society without any outside influence. Riker comments that he thinks everything is going to be just fine. Picard thinks, wow, this Prime Directive thing sure is complicated. And Geordi and Data joke about human intuition, and the book ends. This was such a good book, right up until the end, and then what the heck was that? I'm sincerely baffled by the end. I don't know if the author just realized he was up against his page count and thought, oh crap, I have to end this in 16 pages, I gotta figure out a way to do that. Or if he just painted himself into a corner that he just couldn't get out of in any kind of reasonable way. But that's okay, the ending is bad. I've said my piece about the ending. I don't want to focus on the bad. What I do want to focus on, however, is the chemistry between Geordi and Data in this book. They make such a good duo. Of all the main cast in The Next Generation, I've always thought of Geordi as the most relatably human, while Data is an android who strives to be as human as possible. It's a great combination. In the run of The Next Generation, some of the best B stories featured the growing friendship between Geordi and Data, and they even got a really good A story in Elementary, My Dear Data. An episode that, to be honest, I wasn't a big fan of when I was younger because it didn't really register to me as a Star Trek episode. It was set in Sherlock Holmes times and it felt off to me, but I've really come to appreciate it after several rewatches. It's a good story. I also used to really hate Dr. Pulaski, but I think I just missed Dr. Crusher, and I've kind of softened on that a bit over time. This book had some great moments with Geordi trying to teach Data how to improvise, use his intuition, and play it by ear, while they tried to bluff their way through acting like the Builders. The characterizations of Data and Geordi are also spot on what I would have expected in the TV show, probably due to the fact that this book seems to have been written after at least some of Season 1 aired. There's a reference near the end of the book to Season 1, Episode 9, where Riker is granted Q-like powers by Q and temporarily grants Geordi his vision back, and Geordi is thinking back to that feeling of having eyes and comparing it to one of the gifts he starts using from the repository. So at the very least, I figure this must have been written after that. Unless the author just read the script, I guess. I actually didn't think of that. He may have just read the script. Anyways, that's not the point. The point is he did a great job with Geordi and Data. The rest of the crew are fine as well. I don't remember Dr. Crusher being in this book at all. If she was, it was brief and not memorable. Picard is the only noticeable departure in characterization from the TV show in this book. He's not as severe and strict as he was in Ghost Ship, which is nice, but at times he almost seems panicky and a bit insecure. But it's brief, and he isn't the focal point of the book, so it's forgivable. I also have no complaints about Riker and Yar, aside from me not wanting them to be there because I felt like the Geordi-Data duo was all we really needed. And Worf was there, working the sensors. He didn't really do much important. Ensign Carpelli, however, just killed it on the transporters. He was great. This book also explored some aspects of the Star Trek universe that I found really interesting. One of them I mentioned earlier, the Universal Translator. Now, this isn't completely new. I've heard it mentioned before that the translator works this way. I can't remember exactly where, but I liked how the translator needed to warm up and actually learn the language that it was translating instead of just suddenly magically working. And it also was a device that translated instead of just, the Babelfish, like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where you can just kind of hear in your ear what's going on. I'll give you an example here. "Who are you?" Geordi asked, softly, hoping that anything he said would get the others talking so the Universal Translators would have something to work with. It took only a moment for him to realize that he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Almost the instant the words were out of his mouth, the center alien began speaking, rapidly but stiffly, occasionally faltering and repeating himself, as if he were a schoolboy suffering from terminal stage fright as he tried to recite a poorly memorized speech. Within less than 2 minutes, when the Universal Translators kicked in and began emitting random words and phrases, the speaker became even more rattled, his eyes darting fearfully towards the tiny cylindrical devices. As the phrases became more coherent, Geordi realized that the alien was indeed making a speech, a welcoming speech. So, yeah, the translator takes a couple minutes to kick in and actually start translating things properly, and even then, it's coming from the little cylindrical device. I thought that was a cool touch, and it seems more realistically sci-fi than the ever-present, everybody being able to understand each other at all times thing that you usually get in Star Trek. They also have the ability to turn their translators off at times, and Geordi suggested pretending that they sometimes acted up so that they'd have an excuse to have a side conversation that they didn't want anybody overhearing. There are also some interesting quirks with Data in the Peacekeepers. I can only assume this was written at a point before they had fully fleshed out exactly what Data was and how he worked, because in this book, Data is partially organic. He's described as an android and as an artificial life form, but he also has blood and some organic parts. He also can't stay out in the vacuum of space indefinitely, and it also seems to make his face get puffy when he's out in space unprotected, which I thought was kind of funny. I had to stop and kind of think and decide whether or not this was going to bother me or not. And since overall Data is treated fairly well in this book, and his character acts more or less how I would expect him to based on all of the other Star Trek The Next Generation I've seen, I decided that I was not bothered by it. Instead, I just decided that this was an interesting quirk of how Data works in this book. I was a little worried after reading Ghost Ship. I'm not going to lie. I have fond memories of reading these novels when I was younger, and Ghost Ship was just not good. At least not as a Star Trek book. But reading the Peacekeepers had me feeling relieved. This is just the kind of fun Star Trek adventure that I remember, and most importantly, it feels like a Star Trek book, not just a sci-fi story that has had Star Trek characters pasted over it. So overall, Peacekeepers gets a big thumbs up from me, in spite of a rough ending, because endings are hard. I still haven't figured out how to end a YouTube video well, let alone a novel. So yeah, that's it, I guess. Next episode, I'm going to be talking about The Children of Hamlin by Carmen Carter, a book that I have no memory of reading. So if you want to see that, make sure you subscribe so it pops up on YouTube when my next video is released. So thanks for watching, and talk to you next time.